I'm Sara Rosenkranz. I'm an associate professor in food, nutrition, dietetics, and health, and I teach our sports nutrition course, which is an upper level undergraduate course. I also teach the 2 different undergraduate level research methods classes, which is where I've had many of you. And there's a few of my graduate students on this call as well. So it's great to see you all and have you here. As part of my role in the college, I'm actually our integrative studies coordinator as well. And that I will talk about kind of at the very end, but it's essentially a series of classes that are based around the idea of well-being. And one of the components of well-being is physical well-being. And so I'm going to focus on today a particular area of well-being that's related to nutrition. And as many of you are already aware, or maybe all of you, nutrition and physical activity really sort of go hand in hand, and they work together to determine what our energy balance is, and then ultimately our weight status, and very, very interrelated to physical health, mental well-being, as Jessica mentioned. There are social aspects to food. And so nutrition really cuts across just about every single area of well-being that you can possibly think about. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So is everybody able to see my PowerPoint slides there? Give me the thumbs up, awesome. So periodically throughout the presentation, I'm going to have some questions for you. And I would love it if you would, at least think about what your answer might be, potentially throw those in the chat. And Jessica has agreed to kind of tally those up informally. We don't have to have an exact count, but just to sort of get an idea of where you're coming from, what you're thinking, that kind of thing. Okay, so the idea behind this presentation is really based on the fact that nutrition is ubiquitous because we all eat, and because of the internet and social media and blogs and the current pandemic where we're all at home doing things. This is a particularly important topic. So we've created this awesome internet network where we can have instantaneous access to great information. But the reality is that also gives us access to bad information. And the reality for most of us is that it's pretty hard sometimes to tell the difference between the good and the bad, what to believe, what not to believe. And even if you maybe have a question in the back of your mind, you might be questioning why you think what it is that you think. Okay, see if I can get my slides to advance. There we go. Okay, so we're going to cover some ground today, and with our time, I'll probably run out of time. I'm just going to warn you now because I have a lot of things I would love to talk to you about. The reality is I could probably teach an entire semester's course on this and really discuss kind of the good and the bad, and the myths that are out there, and some of the things that we believe, and whether or not there's actually evidence for the basis of those beliefs. Okay, so as Jessica's advertisement said for you guys, when you do a Google search on what is the best diet, these are some things that actually pop up. That a lot of people are searching for: what is the best diet for weight loss? What is the best diet for health? And then what is the best diet for you? And then there are some kind of common myths that I hear a lot of people talking about. We're going to touch upon some of those. And then also kind of reorient, if we have time, towards some of the deceptive marketing practices, which I think are part of why we believe some of the things that we do, whether or not there's evidence for it. Questions, as Jessica mentioned, I love questions and interactions, so keep it coming. All right, so if you have taken a class from me, you may have already seen this slide before. And so one of the big comparators that we want to kind of orient ourselves to is this idea of pseudoscience versus things that are well-established science, the scientific method, more establishment beliefs, using actual good observations and evidence, hypotheses, analyses, drawing accurate conclusions, and not just a gut feeling or an idea. So I like cartoons, and there's some comparisons here that are kind of funny, but yet you might see some elements that are still there, present, bubbling underneath the surface in our society, some beliefs that are still very persistent, despite the fact that there's not great evidence to support them, okay? And again, if you've taken a class from me, you probably have heard of a lot of these things, but if you have not taken a class from me, then what you might see as you are reading through the list of the things that are on the screen is that there are some things that you probably need to admit to yourself that actually have been persuasive for you in the past. And I don't mean to call you out or ridicule you, because we're human beings and we all fall prey to these things, myself included. I think Jessica might agree as well. And at some point in our lives, we've probably fallen prey to these kinds of ideas there. So things like scientific sounding language, reading something on a blog post that doesn't use references and citations. So pretending to be science is kind of how I put it there. Some things that are often stated around diet and nutrition, where people might say things like, oh, we don't know anything about nutrition. We need to completely throw out the entire body of evidence and start over. And then things toward the bottom of the list here, where we're talking about a powerful government establishment that doesn't want you to know these things, and they're keeping them secret from you. And then sometimes we'll see people who are talking directly to the media rather than going through sort of the more standard practices of doing the science, going through the peer-reviewed process and publishing their work where it can actually be critically appraised. So again, I'm not going to read this list for you. If you've had me before in class, you've heard a lot of these things, but again, as you read through that, you might recognize some things that perhaps have been swaying for you in the past. All right, so this next series of slides is some of the biggest examples of some of the things that we see very commonly when people are trying to convince you that one way of eating may be better for you or worse for you. And so one of those things is this appeal to false authority. And some authority figures are better than others. So the list on here says celebrity, and certainly when we think about diets, there are some diets where we definitely have some celebrities who are having some influence in society. And so some of the people who come to my mind are Gwyneth Paltrow or Tom Brady is another really big one. Can anybody else, if you can think of another one who's a celebrity who's got a huge influence on dietary beliefs, feel free to throw that in the chat, and maybe Jessica can share that with us. I see some coming in, so that's awesome. And I'll give a break here in just a second. But the other things that you'll often see in advertisement that really kind of are related to pseudoscience is that they're appealing to some kind of emotion, sentiment, and then leveraging this distrust of establishment fact, as I was mentioning before. So Jessica, do you want to share a couple of those ideas with us here?
I sure can. We have some good ones. So Oprah and Beyonce, Marie Osmond, the Kardashians, that's what I was thinking of. Kelly Clarkson, Aniston. Yeah, there are a lot of really good.
There are a lot. Yeah, that's excellent. You guys are really good. I need to steal those examples and use them in the future. So thank you for that. So the second one that we see very, very often, and this is something that you may see in yourself, and that's okay, is this idea of pseudoscience relying on subjective validation. Okay, so the example that I always use, it's kind of funny, is that Joe Blow puts Jell-O, so think of a Jell-O block, and he puts it on his head, and his headache goes away. So to pseudoscience, what this tells you is that Jell-O actually made his headache go away. But to science, that indicates that, it's an association, it's a correlation. There's no causation that's going on there. And there may be other things that were occurring at the same time that actually led to his headache going away. Okay, so some examples on there are the moon was full, the bird flew overhead, a window was open, letting in fresh air. He had on his red shirt. So you can kind of see where we often create these connections because we're making observations all the time in our everyday lives. And we start to put together these puzzle pieces to understand and explain and also predict what's going on in our lives. but we often make these subjective validation types of things. And in particular, where we hold beliefs. So if we believe something to be true, and then we observe something that reinforces that belief, well, that's going to strengthen the belief that we have, whether or not it's actually based in evidence. And that's where sort of this idea of superstition and old wives' tales really kind of take a toehold. And the other word I use to describe those sometimes is these zombie lies, that we believe them because we believe them. And that then we look at the world through that lens and we see these things that are giving us a reinforcement of that idea, because we selectively pick the evidence that agrees with the way that we feel. All right, pseudoscience also relies heavily on anachronistic, so it's kind of out of time or out of step thinking. So the older the idea, the better that it is. Society has always been this way. Our ancestors ate this way. Agriculture was this way. And therefore, this must be the best way that human beings should, in fact, eat. And I'm absolutely positive that you can all think of some dietary things that are going on and have been going on for the last decade or so that have become very popular as ideas, really based on this idea that our ancestors did this, okay? It's also very tied in with that idea of superstition, the wisdom of the ancients, and the things that we have believed over time. And pseudoscience often pretends to be one side of a legitimate argument, okay? And I don't really mean to get into political hot button issues, but this one is a great example of this particular point that I'm trying to make. And at a university, I always believe that we can have some controversial ideas and disagreement. And so if you are a big fan of this particular individual, then just take it for what it's worth. And that is really that James Inhofe is not, in fact, an expert in climate science. However, we are pretending when we look at what he's saying here as some sort of equivalent alternative to what 97 or 98% of actual climate scientists say. It's a false equivalency. And we are pretending by taking him as an equal expert that he's a legitimate side of that coin, okay? And you can probably, again, think of many different examples of where this might happen, okay? So if you take an RDN as compared to Joe Blow, who put Jell-O on his head and said it cured his headache, you're creating this sort of false equivalence, okay? And then finally, cherry picking. Cherry picking is really probably the biggest thing. And we do it all the time. So we're reading, we're observing, and we're selecting the things that, again, agree with what we already believe. And so if you think about your social media, your news feed, we have algorithms now that are designed to actually make this problem much, much worse than it already is. So in science, this happens as well. And people will pick the evidence that agrees with the story that they want to tell, and or pick the evidence that is only agreeing with their findings. And there's an example up on here that I'm not going to go into just for the sake of time, okay? All right, so here's your first question. So participation time. One of the questions that we wanted to touch on today is what's the best diet for weight loss? And I have a number of the popular ones that are out there in terms of weight loss listed. And so if you want to in the chat, just throw up the letter that's associated with that particular diet. We'll give you about 30 seconds or so as I'm talking away. And then when I'm done talking away, then I'll ask Jessica to report back on what she's seeing in the chat. And that would be fantastic. So why weight loss? Why focus on weight loss? Well, it's not as if I think that weight is the end all be all in terms of the outcome. It's more that that is, in fact, if you do some Google searching on what people are interested in, and particularly right now in COVID, where we know the data suggests that people are actually doing worse with regard to their weight status, I felt like it was an important topic to touch on. There's a huge multi-billion-dollar diet industry out there for a good reason, because people actually are very, very interested in this. And we'll talk about some of the statistics here in in a second after we get the results from our survey. All right, so a couple more seconds here. And Jessica, do you want to share what you're seeing in the chat?
Yeah, so every single letter got at least one vote. A lot of you are very smart and you're saying none of these, right? But I think D.
That wasn't an option.
I know. But D, I would say D is the one that got probably some of the most votes.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for that information. And we're going to talk about that idea. And I will say before I move on that I'm not surprised by that, and particularly because of some of the research for short-term weight loss, and the ketogenic diet is in fact has been shown several times across multiple studies to be superior to other weight loss strategies in the short term. Okay, so good for you if you picked that one. There wasn't a right or a wrong answer, but I was trying to get a sense of what people are thinking at this point. Ultimately, sometimes science, as indicated in my pseudoscience slides, can be something that people don't want to hear, and that is that, you know, we create a lot of questions as we're trying to come up with answers, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's really what science is about. So when you talk to a scientist, usually they're going to give you some things that might not be super fulfilling. You might not be very satisfied with them, because they should speak in uncertainty, because most things are uncertain. And certainly when it comes to nutrition, there's a lot that we don't yet know. On the flip side of that, there is a lot that we actually do know, okay? So why focus on weight loss? Well, you can see the prevalence statistics, and this is just obesity. It doesn't even include overweight. So if we start to put together our overweight and obesity statistics, then that number is going to pop up to somewhere around 3/4 of our population of the United States falls into a BMI, body mass index, of either overweight or obese. So certainly this is an issue in our society, and it is not the case that we have people who are hypermuscular, where we're seeing BMIs increase over time because we've got so many people who are weightlifters. No, we're seeing a lot of weight gain, and the people who are already overweight or obese are actually doing worse than they were before. So you see that stat on here that the prevalence of severe obesity in the same time period has actually increased as well. So people are doing worse. And these obesity related conditions that we have in our society are also very prevalent. Some of the leading causes of death that we have, impacting our health, impacting our economy, impacting our well-being in very, very real ways. And then very last, I have up some statistics about what some of the medical costs are for obesity. My personal sense is I'm not as worried about that, but I know that health economists would tell you that's incredibly important, and certainly it is. I'm more focused on, you know, how are we doing as a society? How's that impacting our health, our well-being, etc. So there are real reasons to focus on weight loss. All right, so what's a fad diet? If we take a look at a fad diet, then typically we're going to define that as a diet that is well outside of what the mainstream recommendations are. It's often going to come along with promises that certainly are not realistic. It's going to have a super restriction of one component of a macronutrient, or really, really extreme caloric restriction, with the idea kind of that it's not going to be sustainable over time. So some of the things that might send red flags or bells and whistles to you as you're looking at it is a diet that's promising weight loss of 2 pounds or more per week without having to diet or exercise. So somehow you're losing weight magically. Substantial weight loss, no matter what you eat. Doesn't matter, you can eat as much as you want and still lose weight. Weight loss that's actually permanent. Blocking absorption of fat or calories. And there are some pharmaceuticals where they can effectively do that, but certainly not an actual diet that we know of. Severe caloric restriction. There are some that are like as low as 500 calories a day. Restricting many foods or food groups, putting things off limits. And certainly ones that don't teach you about proper lifestyle, or who say you don't have to exercise and you can still lose weight, which may be true, but it certainly shouldn't be a recommendation. And then there are some that are, you can actually lose weight by rubbing some sort of cream on your body, etc. Okay, so there are many of them out there. I could give you a list of hundreds of them literally. And as I mentioned before, the weight loss industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry for good reason. There's a lot of money to be made. So we're going to stick with some study evidence. I teach research methods, and I'm going to stick with what the science actually tells us. So if we look across studies where they've compared many different popular weight loss methods, the idea behind the A to Z diet, which is really an intervention that has been studied a few different times in a few different ways using different dietary strategies. But the idea there is that you're kind of comparing the extremes in terms of minimizing one macronutrient, maximizing another, and they're meant to kind of stand in for those extreme reductions in one macronutrient, as I was mentioning before, with some fad diet kind of ideas, and then comparing it to what the recommendations are from the dietary guidelines for Americans and other professional bodies of experts. Okay, so over on the left-hand side, I have 2 figure 2s, but those were not ones that I made, which is why they have the same number. And from the original A to Z diet, what we see here is the reason why probably many of you answered Atkins or really this sort of ketogenic diet is because when we look at the ketogenic diet or a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet of any sort, then we often see some results that look very typical to what you see in this left-hand side figure, where in the short term, you see faster weight loss in these types of diets. And then at the 6-month point, you're going to often see something that looks a little bit like this, that all of these different diets can be effective for weight loss in the short term with that high fat or ketogenic diet, low carbohydrate option being a little bit better in terms of the outcomes that you see. So can you imagine what might be going on there? What would be creating this difference at 6 months? And feel free to chime in if you would like to. I'll give you about 30 seconds or so again to think about what might be happening. We can think of a mechanism through which that would be true.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so why would you think that at that 6-month time period, a diet that might be ketogenic or high fat, low carbohydrate, like the Atkins diet, and we see that across a number of different studies. So what's creating that difference between this particular diet and others at the 6-month time point?
Maybe your body's getting used to what you're consuming, and so it doesn't really have that effect of weight loss anymore.
Okay, well, I'm asking for why it actually might be effective at 6
Oh, okay,
months.
sorry.
But I get your point. No, you're fine. You're fine. You're thinking in the right direction. Okay.
Some people in the chat have said your body's adjusting to the macros or acclimating itself to your calorie intake.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. In a nutshell, there are a couple of different things that are probably going on here. One is that you're actually eating fewer calories because you've markedly changed the way that you were eating from before, okay? So it's a real behavioral thing that's going on. And ultimately, Atkins ketogenic low carbohydrate diet is not magic, okay? And I'm always kind of a little bit shocked and dismayed when students actually think that you can eat the same number of calories and still lose weight. The reality is that is not likely to be the case at all. But in fact, in the short term, there's a lot of water loss that's happening, particularly at the very, very beginning when you see that really rapid weight loss occurring, which can also be reinforcing to a lot of people, encouraging them to have persistence and to keep with the diet. So that can actually be a real motivator, which is a positive for that type of diet. But then what you ultimately see across multiple studies is that adherence falls off, weight is regained, and while there still might be a net loss, then at that 12-month, maybe even 24 months, if we look at some other studies, we see that fall off. And that happens time and time and time and time and time and time and time again. And depending on your comparison, ultimately what ends up happening is that what's shown in the second figure 2, adherence to whatever dietary strategy you've got is a lot more important of a predictor for success in weight loss than is what diet you got assigned in your intervention. And in fact, even if you had a choice in the matter, it would not matter. What matters is that you can adhere to that dietary strategy whereby you're actually creating a negative energy balance, okay? So in the interest of time, I'm going to show you a couple of things that are based on systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So now we're not just cherry picking one study. We're actually looking at the preponderance of evidence around a topic, the best available evidence that we have. So here's another one where they actually looked at 14 different popular diets. And you can kind of see up here, I've put in a nutshell what the findings were. So once again, weight reduction at the 12-month follow-up was diminished. And aside from that Mediterranean diet, improvements in cardiovascular risk factors largely disappeared as well, because we know that weight loss is one of those factors that really drives the improvements in metabolic or cardiovascular health markers that we might have. And differences between diets were typically small and trivial, and often based on low quality or low certainty evidence. And really, that's what we see in our research is that, time and time again, we hear the same exact story, is that it doesn't really matter. In the short term, we can lose weight in many, many, many different ways. The harder bit is maintaining that over time, okay? Another meta-analysis, so a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, where they looked at intermittent fasting, which is a really popular one right now, versus just our typical sort of caloric restriction for weight loss. And what we saw there was both intermittent fasting and continuous energy restriction had really, really similar effects on promoting weight loss. And so we probably need some more trials, but at the end of the day, if intermittent fasting worked for you, then you lost some weight. If continuous energy restriction worked for you, then you lost some weight. And the reality is that there's really no light of day between those two strategies, as long as you're adhering to whichever strategy you were assigned to or you pick in your own particular life. And so those effects were variable. You can see that within each individual study. This line represents the heterogeneity or the variability in the responses. And some people actually gained weight on intermittent fasting. Some people lost weight as compared to the continuous energy restriction, but the net effect was not significant and very, very little difference between those two dietary strategies. All right, so what's the best diet for health then? Well, why do we care about that? Most of you are super young and invincible and probably don't have, well, maybe, I should not assume, maybe you have some chronic diseases already, or you know somebody who does, and it's really impacted your life in some really meaningful way. But as a society, we're not doing very well with these non-communicable chronic diseases, and particularly ones that are related to obesity and also related to nutrition. So the stats up here, 6 in 10 adults in the US have a chronic disease, and 4 in 10 have 2 or more chronic diseases, because often those diseases actually go hand in hand, okay? And there are so many chronic diseases out there that are actually related to the nutrition and the foods that we eat. And so you can see some of the main culprits up here, some of the top causes of morbidity and mortality in our society. And certainly all of these have a substantive nutrition or diet related component to them, highly associated with the nutrition that we're taking in and highly associated with obesity. And that includes actually many different types of cancer that are also related to overweight and obesity, okay? So I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this slide just in the interest of time. So your next question is, true or false? Cutting carbohydrate is necessary for good health in the long term. So you can just throw in the chat true or false, and I see some answers coming in. So we'll give you just a few more, I don't know, maybe 10 more seconds on that one. What are you seeing in the chat?
mostly false, but there's a couple of truths coming through as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. The dietary guidelines for Americans, if you're my student, you have heard me talk about this probably ad nauseum, and that is every 5 years we get a new set of dietary guidelines. These dietary guidelines are developed using a very, very rigorous process whereby we bring together top experts. They can be MDs, they can be nutritionists, they can be nutrition scientists, etc., who evaluate all of the highest quality evidence using a very systematic approach. They look at systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and they look at dietary patterning, and they take all of these sources together and combine them into what is the preponderance of evidence telling us, okay? And so when we look at the dietary guidelines for Americans and how we are doing with some of those foods that we can clearly see might be associated with obesity, but also with some of the important health outcomes, on the blue side of the bar, you can see these are the ones where Americans are not doing very well in terms of getting enough of these particular types of foods. And so broadly speaking, we're talking about vegetables, we're talking about fruits, and we are talking about whole grains, okay? So what would you say about this whole left side? What types of foods are these? Well, they're carbohydrates, aren't they? So if I were to ask you that question again, what would you say? Do we need to reduce our intake of these foods in order to have good long-term health? No, absolutely not. But we might actually want to reduce our intake of this one up here, which clearly we get lots and lots and lots of. So my hypothesis and what I would pose to you is that perhaps rather than being carbohydrate restrictive, we should reorient our focus a little bit to carbohydrate specific, or carbohydrate selective might be a term that we might want to use, because there are many, many carbohydrate containing foods that have known and substantive health benefits, usually the plant-based ones of origin. Okay, so let's move on and take a look. So choose My Plate. My Plate is the guide to eating that allows you to follow the recommendations from the dietary guidelines for Americans. And we just got a new set in 2020, so very, very recent. There has been an umbrella or a network review of meta-analyses. And so they actually looked across lots of different meta-analyses, and they found that diets that scored high on indices of adherence to the recommendations from the dietary guidelines for Americans were associated with a significant reduction in the risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes. Sounds familiar, right? Those ones that I was saying were highly associated with diet and obesity from an earlier slide. But we'll add on there neurodegenerative disease too, and certainly aging, dementia is a big issue for us in our society right now. But those are pretty compelling evidence across a huge body of research that shows that following these dietary guidelines, and from the previous slide, you can see that we do a poor job of that. In our society, we're not doing a very good job of following our dietary guidelines. But if we were, perhaps we could get some movement on some of these really, really big population health issues. All right, so to the carbohydrate point, both the high intake of carbohydrates, so over here on this side, and the low intake of carbohydrate have increased risk associated with them. And this is particularly for all-cause mortality from this particular, I think this one was a prospective cohort study with a meta-analysis attached to it, published in the Lancet. And essentially what they're showing there is that if you're eating somewhere in the range of where the dietary guidelines actually say that you should eat, what the recommendations are, then you have a lower risk for mortality, okay? When you're going well outside of those ranges, then you might be at an increased risk for mortality, okay? And this is population level, so we can't ever identify an individual's specific risk, but we can look at patterns. And that's exactly what we want to do, to try to predict what is going to happen and what's going on. So The other thing to kind of make note of is that if we are eating markedly differently from what the recommendations are, that means that something that we are decreasing is going to get replaced with something else. And a lot of times the answer to whether or not that change is good or bad has to do with what you are actually replacing it with. So if we reduce fat intake and replace it with added sugar, that might not be a great idea. If we reduce carbohydrate intake and we replace it with a whole lot of processed meat, that might not be a good outcome either. So sometimes the answer is not as simple as just reducing a macronutrient, but we also have to consider what is it that you're actually replacing it with. All right, so within that idea of dietary quality, we want to consider the idea of ultra-processed foods, of which there are many, many. The food marketing, food manufacturing companies have filled our shelves with all different kinds of foods that kind of look like this. They are energy dense. They are low in nutrient value. So nutrient density is poor. And they're not really value add, okay? The other thing to note, and I don't really have time to go into this in depth, but really there's been some very compelling research that suggests that when people eat those ultra processed diets, then what happens is we actually eat more. And so a study that was done by Dr. Kevin Hall, the National Institutes of Health, pretty recently anyway, showed that when you did that, when you offered up people with foods that were similar in calories and macronutrient distribution, what you saw is the people who had the ultra processed food options actually ate on average 500 calories a day more than those who ate the much less like whole foods, unprocessed sorts of diets there. So just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. And I already mentioned this idea, but nutrient density. So back to that figure where it showed where Americans are doing well and where we're not doing well, those foods where we're not doing well are also those same foods that are very nutrient dense. And our brand new dietary guidelines very clearly show that, really about 85% of our diet needs to be filled with these nutrient dense options in order to be able to get the vitamins and the minerals and the macronutrients that we actually need, whereby about 15% for most people is going to be kind of those added, added sugars, solid fats, or other nutrients that maybe aren't quite as beneficial for us. All right, so what's the best diet for health ultimately? What's the best diet for you, right? So this was a paper that was written by David Katz and Miller. And essentially, I really like it because what it shows you is that there is not one diet that's perfect. There's not one diet that's the best. There's not only one answer to this question. And to meet the dietary guidelines for Americans, you can eat in many, many different ways and still achieve those same outcomes. And every diet probably has something about it that is good, that you could take and you could put it in your toolbox and you might use it and it could be beneficial for you. And then the other thing to kind of take note of is that every one of these types of diets has something that might be synergistic. So if you take a look at this, it's kind of pulling out the elements from each diet that could potentially have health benefits. And then the compatible elements are listed there in the middle. Limited refined starches, or our ultra-processed foods, added sugars, or our ultra-processed foods, processed foods, and particularly those ultra-processed foods, limiting intake of certain fats and emphasis on whole plant foods with or without lean meats, fish, poultry, seafood. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it looks a lot like that My Plate schematic does. Food, not too much, mostly plants. Okay. All right, so if there's not one right weight loss diet, then what might we do to help ourselves with that? Well, there's a whole lot of work going on now about getting away from these sort of reductionist viewpoints of what must you do and do you have to be perfect and then develop orthorexia or, just have this idea of perfectionism and beat ourselves up and flog ourselves and feel bad about failing and not adhering to this very stringent diet that is just not going to be something that you can sustain for the long period of time, but rather focusing on behaviors and how to set up your environment to be successful over a long period of time. So strategies out there like goal setting and really kind of paying attention to where you are right now and where you want to be with your weight, with your health, with your physical activity, with your dietary intake. And certainly within that is not just a giant goal of losing 50 or 100 pounds, but how are you going to get from here to 5 to 10? Or, you know, eating more fruits and vegetables. How are you going to get from here to just adding a few in and getting away from those processed foods? Rewarding yourself in real ways. And that doesn't have to be something that costs money, but, you know, taking a luxury bath in your house. You know, it could be having a dance party. It could be monetary, like buying yourself a new workout outfit or a healthy meal, many different things. We don't really want them to be food rewards, but if it's a healthy food reward, then I'm probably on board. Self-monitoring is a huge part of it. All of the data show us that people who are successful with weight loss maintenance are doing some kind of monitoring. And then paying attention to your triggers, your cues, what's going on. It's a huge social component to food. We can set up our environments to either encourage or discourage success. And then eating slowly and paying attention, making sure that we're actually satisfied with the foods that we're picking. And that means that you don't want to be following a diet that's not going to work for you just because Gwyneth Paltrow or Kim Kardashian told you to. You want to follow something that's going to be sustainable for you over the long term, okay? Ultimately, the combination of a reduced calorie diet and increased physical activity is recommended because we can maintain our lean body mass. We can eat more with that type of approach, and we can maintain fitness over time. That helps us to avoid muscle loss as we lose weight. So all good things. So weight loss, weight maintenance therapy, oftentimes are mental health issues that are associated with overweight and obesity that we also need to deal with, like depression and anxiety, for example. So that might actually happen in concert. All right, so I feel like I probably need to stop. I kind of figured I might get to this point, and that was where I was going to end with just being really aware of marketing strategies and how they fool us into thinking that we might be doing something that's healthy for ourselves, while really their focus is on selling you a product. And it's disingenuous. It's understandable because people are trying to get a market share and make some money. But this slide, I think, does a really nice job of kind of orienting you to some of the practices that might be misleading and might be persuasive as well. I know, for example, I saw a Pepsi product a number of years ago where they actually put vitamins in the Pepsi, and I can't remember what the name of it was, but I thought, well, that's really interesting. So suddenly this Pepsi full sugar, it has vitamins in it, so it must be good for you. But that was just a really stark example. I think sometimes these sorts of practices are less easy and overt to see, but this has a great example of what maybe some of these ones are that are very common out there. So I apologize that I ran out of time. What I would like to do at this point is skip ahead to my very last slide, and then I'm going to open it up for, I see lots and lots of questions. So I'm going to open it up for, there we go. So I'm just putting in a plug for what Jessica has put together, because in our college, we are very focused on people first and on well-being among our faculty, staff, and students. And this set of courses that we put together is all about well-being. And so if you have an interest in further digging into any of these topics, I definitely encourage you to take some nutrition or physical activity related coursework where you've got an opportunity to do so. And if you're really interested in well-being, then any of these courses might also be of interest to you. But do keep in mind that it's required to take the Introduction to Wellbeing course before you might take any of these other courses. but they're a half a credit hour each. And so they only last for they last for 5 weeks each semester. So not too much of a time commitment. And I think they're great opportunities to do some work on yourself and your own personal well-being.